Welcome back, everybody out there in podcast land. It's Wes here on A Different Strings, a guitar adjacent podcast. And here with me, as always, is Andrew. Say hello to everybody, Andrew.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, we are going to get into a Music That Matters episode here featuring the one and only Pink Floyd. But before we do that, Andrew, please tell everybody where they can find us on the internet.
Folks, would you kindly visit us on the web at differentstringspodcast.com? I promise you will find blog posts, links to past episodes, and some other goodies as we continue to build our guitar adjacent empire.
That was absolutely brilliant, Andrew. Thank you very much. And I teased that we're going to do Pink Floyd, and you can't see my computer right now because you're looking at my face. But right now I have up on my computer that I was halfway through listening before we had to start recording this episode, Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here album, which almost nobody says is their best album or their favorite Pink Floyd album. The ones that most people get, what do you think are the two most often cited Pink Floyd albums?
Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall.
There you go, right? And those are kind of the beginning and the end of the Roger Waters era, where Roger Waters was the primary songwriter in Pink Floyd. And those are both, don't get me wrong, those are both fantastic albums. But the album we're going to talk about here is their 1977 album called Animals.
Ooh.
Yes, which is 100% my favorite Pink Floyd album. It was not only my introduction to Pink Floyd, but has remained my one true Pink Floyd love since I first heard it when I was 13 years old on 8-track, Andrew. Let that sink in. My first copy of Animals was on 8-track.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That was a format that needed to die because halfway through a song, it would have to switch sides and half the song
it had to chunk through the tracks. And it did just that in the middle of Dogs, which is 17 minutes long.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but listen, I'm all about progress. But if you're going to make progress, make progress. Listening to a record, you hear the entire song. Yeah. On 8-track, there was the risk of your favorite song getting cut off by this 8-track switching sides, which is ridiculous. Anyway, I digress. That was ridiculous.
And it's really hard for me to express how powerful and influential the album Animals has been in my life. It is the only Pink Floyd album I listen to obsessively over and over and over.
Really?
I like Dark Side. I like Wish You Were Here. I like The Wall. I really do. But I love Animals.
And, and given how long the songs are,
it was
something.
It was kind of my introduction as well to the long form song, which wasn't something, at 13 years old, I was listening to pop radio. I lived in Belgium, and I listened to French language stations, German language stations, Dutch language stations. And for 2 hours every Saturday, some of the kids at my high school got to spin records on AFRTS, Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, on the FM dial. So, and there was a lot of Police back then, right? So Animals was about 5 years old when I discovered it, 83.
Okay.
And since then, since the first 8-track, I've had it on cassette. I've had it on LP, obviously. I've had it on CD. And I've bought every new version they've come out with, culminating with the 2018 remix/remaster that David Gilmour and Roger Waters fought over for so long that it didn't come out until this year. Actually, it may have come out last year, but I don't think so.
So talk to me. So first of all, when you suggested this album as Music That Matters, I, of course, had to go back and listen to it, which I haven't done in a very long time.
Yeah.
And it made me appreciate it so much more. And here's what I want you to talk about, and I hope you will. Number one, I want to hear why this album spoke to you so much and continues to, because I have different answers. But I also want to hear from you what this album meant to you, what it continues to mean to you, because I got to be honest, listening to it as a kid and listening to it as an adult, very different experience.
Yeah, very different experience. I think that, so first of all, I don't really pay attention to lyrics. I just don't care. I want there to be a cool melody. I want to hear some harmony vocals, but I don't really listen to lyrics.
Okay.
But I've heard this album so many times that I know all of the lyrics, and I have since I was in my early teens,
Okay.
you know? Um, and the so this Animals came out. So all right, everybody that knows about Pink Floyd knows that The Wall was kind of Roger's expression of how much he hated being a rock star.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. and
He
and
really
he really
disdained the
did.
fans, and he hated what he had become and what his fans expected. Like, he was so
Yeah, he just hated the
disillusioned.
whole thing.
The whole
Well,
album is just, it drips of that.
that feeling started to develop during the tour for Wish You Were Here,
Yep.
and then into the writing, and some of the songs
When he
that,
spit on a fan.
yeah, some of the songs from Animals were written and considered for the Wish You Were Here album, and they were played on tour. um and then they became, once he came up with the concept, they became the songs that they are. And it is a concept album loosely based around a novella called Animal Farm, written by
Mm-hmm.
George Orwell, that is a satire slash critique of Soviet style communism.
Yep.
Right. So if you've never read the book, and you should, even though, the comparisons are a little dated because no more Soviet Union,
Mm.
and no more 60s Soviet Union, no more 50s and 60s Soviet Union, which was a very different place than the 80s and 90s Soviet Union. Well, the 80s, because 90, anyways. Animal Farm features a few types of animals very heavily. Sheep, of course, and that's the segment of society that kind of rolls along without very much intervention in their own lives. They kind of allow other people to make big decisions for them, even to the point of being manipulated by those in power, right? Dogs in Animal Farm represent the secret police, an organization called the NKVD, right? But on the album, the dogs represent a certain type of ruthless, cutthroat businessman.
Okay.
And I will normally I would say business person, but in this instance, we really are looking at business men, males. They will do anything and everything to make a buck, or for Roger, a pound. And the pigs in Animal Farm, in the book Animal Farm, the pigs are the ones who take over the farm and slowly start behaving like the men that the farm animals rebelled against, even to the point of, by the end of the book, they are wearing clothing and walking on their hind legs, right? I know, spoiler, but that doesn't really spoil it. You can see that coming from the behavior of Napoleon and Snowball. Anyways, on the album Animals, Roger is attacking the ruling class, right? These so-called masters of the universe, these people who have put themselves in charge of nuclear weapons and national economies. There are three specific pigs that Roger attacks with this song. And I always thought it was government figures, because I didn't understand. I'm not British, so I didn't understand, and I wasn't an adult in the 70s and 80s, so I didn't understand the references. So I had to look up the people that he was really rallying against. CEOs of the business world, so it's an extension of dogs. These are people who care more about profits than people, And I think that's something that has affected your life recently. So you understand this. Conservatives like Margaret Thatcher, who was the prime minister of the UK around the same time that Ronald Reagan was president in the United States, but also everything that her political party represented going into the 1980s when she was on the rise. And the third pig is somebody called Mary Whitehouse, who was basically a right-wing activist in the UK in the 60s and 70s. And her big ticket was reintroducing social stigmas connected to sexual behaviors, right? The 60s were a time of sexual liberation, and she wanted to make sex shameful again.
That
right?
sounds like a good way to, that sounds like a good political campaign slogan. Make homosexuality shameful again.
Yeah, and all of it,
right?
Because it apparently just threatened the fabric of existence in the UK.
So he was going after and by the way, just to be clear, I was being sarcastic. We don't want to do that.
I got you. Yeah.
But he was going after specific people. So it's interesting. I always thought, and that's why I like albums, is you can make your own interpretation. I always figured it. I always thought pigs, dogs, and sheep were business, politics, and the general public.
Yeah, and that's pretty close.
Okay. But he was going after specific people, you're saying he had in mind. Interesting. I see, I never knew that.
Yeah, that's actually why the song is called Pigs, parentheses, 3 different ones, close parentheses.
Oh, Roger was smart.
Roger was when
he may have been angry, he may have been very antisocial, but he was also very smart.
Yeah, I mean, and so for somebody who grew up disconnected from family the way I did, I grew up as a military brat. I never, until I was 12 years old, I never went to the same school 2 years in a row.
That's kind of
sometimes changed schools in the middle of the school year. I changed countries in the middle of the school year once.
Wow.
Yeah. So 5th and 6th grade was the first time I ever went to the same school 2 years in a row and had the same friends for 2 years in a row.
That's tough.
And even then, the summer between 5th and 6th grade, a bunch of kids rotated back to the world, back to the States.
Yeah.
Because that's just how the military worked back then, or at least the Air Force. So the overarching theme of Dogs is, or the Animals album is, the disaffection of the human race.
Okay.
And Dogs blames businessmen for that disaffection. Pigs blames these 3 people for that disaffection, and sheep blames the rest of us who allow it to happen. Right. So it's like, it's so angsty and depressing and anxious and harsh. Something in me as a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid connected with that feeling of disaffection, that feeling of that existential fear of having no ability to advance your own life and being stuck in your class or your position, whatever you want to call it, because of the CEOs, because of the politicians, because of society not giving anybody the opportunity to break out of their box. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, Andrew, the sick twin lead harmonized guitar solos in Dogs grabbed my ear before I ever thought about being a guitar player. And there's a reason why I liked Queen and Iron Maiden. And a lot of that goes back to listening to Animals over and over and over before I ever heard of those bands.
So the album captures you musically as a young child, and then as you get older, and continue to listen to the album, the lyrics start to appeal to you and resonate with you on a
Yeah.
different level.
Yeah. And it also, you know, when I was in high school was when I was discovering writing and reading for more than just entertainment,
Mhm.
right? And trying to get symbolism and understanding the poetry of lyrics, whatever you want to call it. And that really drew me in about this album. And like I said, almost in anti my position in life as a person who really doesn't pay attention to lyrics. But when you listen to an album literally hundreds of times, you're going to absorb some of the message.
Yeah.
And you know, I certainly try not to be a dog. I absolutely don't want to be a pig. And I'm trying real hard not to be a sheep. Right. So, from a musical standpoint, too, the album is really rich and varied in its tones and tonality. Um, there's a lot of acoustic guitar, which is not really a primary instrument for much of Pink Floyd.
No.
Um, but Dogs, especially 17 minutes long, not only is like driven by an acoustic guitar, but it's tuned down a full step
Mhm.
to put the song basically, you know, in a better register for Roger to sing, and it works. Long stretches of harmonized guitar solos from the one, the only David Gilmour, and just spacey interludes that are carried by that acoustic guitar and the electric piano work of Richard Wright, right?
You know, it's interesting that you bring up Animals as a music that matters, because in their catalog, especially given where it's sandwiched,
Yeah.
to me, it's musically a very different record for them.
Yeah, it really doesn't sound like any of their other albums. And when you
Lots of
listen,
keyboards, and
yeah,
which is a
so
good thing for
much.
them.
Yeah, and Richard Wright, I think, is pretty overlooked, especially given how much Roger Waters ended up hating the guy and bad mouthing him in later
To the
years.
point where the final cut, he was gone.
Yeah. Well, even before that, I mean, he was I remember famously, Richard Wright is the only member of Pink Floyd that made money on the tour for The Wall because he had been fired and then rehired as a musician rather than a part of the band.
Oh, I didn't even know that. I just
Yeah.
knew he wasn't there for the final cut.
Yeah.
Now,
So the song Pigs is driven by a staccato, almost a funky rhythm, with really kind of guttural guitars.
mhm.
Um, Sheep is features some of the most brilliant Rhodes piano work from Richard Wright, and it builds up to this really kind of bass heavy driving rhythm that shows how steady and solid a bass player Roger Waters is. You know, Roger gets a lot of grief for his politics, for his attitude, for his trying to rewrite the history of Pink Floyd, for his re-recording of Dark Side of the Moon.
He doesn't make it
The,
easy.
he doesn't make it, he is not an easy person to like, but he was a really good bass player in this era. And he really, especially on Sheep, he really shows what he can do. Nick Mason is a monster on the drums, especially in Sheep. And it's just, it flows, right? The song, all of the songs have an ebb and flow to them, but Sheep especially has a push and a pull that clearly shows they're not working with a click track. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
The song is bookended by a little solo acoustic
Mhm.
ditty called "Pigs on the Wing."
Yeah.
It's a folky little stab that enabled Roger to get an extra songwriting credit on the album because he split it into two. But as as depressing and anxious and angst ridden as the album is, at the end of Pigs on the Wing Part 2 is the last thing on the album.
Mhm.
is just a tiny little sliver of upbeatness. And it's almost the last upbeat thing Roger Waters ever writes as a member of Pink Floyd. And he uses the lyrics, "You know that I care what happens to you, and I know that you care for me too." So in the reflecting on all of this societal woe, he comes back to the theme that caring for each other matters. And it really is an uplifting way to end the album. It's almost like he's saying that no matter how much the dogs try to screw you, how bad the pigs make things for you, and how ignored and manipulated you are by the sheep, as long as you have somebody to love and somebody who loves you, things are probably going to be okay for you. And that was also a really powerful message for 13 and 16 and 20-year-old me. And I continue to reflect on it as I have grown up and have had to deal with the business world and have had to be affected by politicians and activists, and find myself hamstrung by society in a lot of ways that doesn't do the things that I wish it would to make life better for me and people like me in a lot of ways. Which is not to acknowledge that, as a white adult male, I don't have a lot of built-in privilege. But, everything isn't easy for everybody, no matter what your background is. And Animals, even to this day, is a cathartic way for me to experience some music and to explore my own thoughts and feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But I will admit, listening to Animals can be a little exhausting, especially if you really focus on the lyrics. I mean, there's one in the middle of Sheep, there's an interlude, and you almost can't understand what's happening. It's the sheep are talking, and they're reciting the Lord's Prayer in a very twisted, satirical rewrite that ends with them basically being slaughtered.
So not a light listen.
No, not a light listen. But it's three of Pink Floyd's longest, most complex songs. They've done a bunch of other songs that are longer than this album, even longer than Dogs, which is, if I didn't mention it before, is 17 minutes. But the complexity of the music and the depth of the lyrics makes listening to Animals straight through kind of a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't ever, like, Animals is not in any of my playlists, because if I hear one song, I need to hear the song after it.
Yeah.
And the song, I got to listen to the whole album. I always listen to the whole album. If I don't have time to listen to the album, I don't listen to any of it.
Yeah.
So because it's a marathon that you have to run.
It has to be listened to in its entirety to absorb the message and to appreciate it. Yeah. It's interesting too. We've talked a lot about this already, but it bears repeating that where this album happens in Pink Floyd's history is, as you mentioned, Roger is becoming more and more disillusioned with the rock star life.
Yeah.
He literally disdains the fans. He hates what he's become, he's been forced to become.
He hates them and himself.
Yeah. And so this album comes out of that. And you would think that this album would have been, I released all of my anger, my bitterness, my demons.
And then next is The Wall.
The Wall. And given the context, I think we all know what The Wall is. Roger is the Pink Floyd character, and he's literally building a wall between himself and the rest of the world, brick by brick. And you can kind of picture Roger's what he's going through, what he's dealing with, his anger, his bitterness, his anxiety, and why he wants to do this, his isolation, how he feels.
Yeah.
Because by the end of the Wall tour, and what the final cut basically, if you listen to the final cut, it's a Roger Waters solo album.
Yeah, it's his first solo album. It just happened to have David Gilmour and Nick Mason playing on it.
Yeah. I mean, David sings what, one song?
If that, I'm not even sure he does.
Yeah, he might sing a song, and it's Roger's first solo album. This Animals is the first of many albums that really establishes what Roger's going through. And when you think of it like that, and you listen to the lyrics, and because I think the music really does. I think in this case, the music and the lyrics match up pretty well. Like,
yeah,
I guess what I'm trying to say is the music has a mood, the lyrics kind of solidify that. It kind of, The Wall is the same way. Like the music and the lyrics in The Wall, you can hear what's going on with Roger. He's all over if you listen to Dark Side of the Moon, that's a very different type of record.
Yeah, it is.
Wish You Were Here, very different type of record. It's like this was the beginning of the end for Roger, and it took several albums to get there.
Yeah. And I always thought it was interesting that in the song Have a Cigar, on Wish You Were Here, Roger relates something that apparently really happened with a record company executive talking to the band and then going, "Oh, by the way, which one of you guys is Pink?"
So
thinking that Pink Floyd was a person, a human. And from that, I think, is where the germ of The Wall starts, where he turns Pink into a person. And it's him, and the staggering mental health issues that this 2-album, well, 3-album technically, because The Wall is a double album, that Animals Into the Wall shows is kind of what music is all about. Now, I'm not saying that it was a good thing that Roger Waters was obviously dealing with some mental health issues, but getting them out and expressing them and turning them into art is what musicians do. And here he is really trying to deal with his issues, and it didn't work. You know, I mean, he seems to be much more himself these days, even though I don't like who he's become as a person. He seems to be much better at dealing with his fans and playing his shows, and he's not the guy that spits on people now.
Yeah. I kind of think it's interesting that, in a way, Roger attempted to build a wall around himself and his audience, and by doing so, he created arguably the band's most popular record.
Yeah.
It's like, Roger, you are who you are. You're a guy who, for better or worse, you wrote music and lyrics that appealed
to people.
Appealed to millions of people. Unfortunately, you weren't able at the time to appreciate that. Hopefully he's come to some level of peace with that.
Yeah, I hope so. And I know that, there was a lot of bitterness amongst the band during the Animals recording sessions,
and continues to be that.
And continues to be.
Roger will not. They're just, David's wife and Roger have battled it out on Twitter, if you can believe that.
I can. And the fighting over the release of the remix is just part and parcel. I mean, I'm not surprised that it took them 5 years to put this album out after the remix was done, and they were arguing over liner notes because, like I said earlier, Roger accused David of trying to rewrite Pink Floyd's history, and David was like, yeah, Roger's full of crap. You know, and who knows which of them was right. Eventually they did put it out, and I'll say this about the remix: in some places it is better than the original mix, and that's coming from somebody who listened to the original mix in a multitude of formats dozens and dozens of times over 2 decades plus.
Yeah, I mean, what's going on with Roger in that, he first of all, he released the Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which was actually at the time a pretty
Good album.
Yeah. And I thought he was going to make a career for himself post Pink Floyd as Roger Waters. I'm not going to need. Meanwhile, decades later, he releases The Wall as a live album. And then,
as a phenomenal live album, by the way.
And then he releases The Dark Side of the Moon Redux in 2023.
I don't know. I think there's a certain part of him that really just doesn't want David to win. That's what I think it comes down to.
That's a shame.
Yeah. And I'll say I don't care for any of Pink Floyd's material before Dark Side of the Moon. I don't get it, and I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
So like Atom Heart Mother and Metal, I just don't. I'm not into it. I've heard all those albums,
mm-hmm.
but that run of 4 albums from Dark Side to The Wall is astonishingly good music, and Animals pops out right at the top. And I'll throw on the Final Cut every now and then. I have that on LP, and I listen to that every now and then.
Yeah, I think Dark Side of the Moon was like I agree with you. Like pre Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd is not something I like go out of my way to listen to.
Yeah.
But anything after that it's gold. But I also agree, or I also want to state that I don't think Pink Floyd's done a whole lot of great things since then.
No, I mean it was really clear that David Gilmour is no slouch when it comes to songwriting.
No,
absolutely. I've got his solo album from the 70s, and it's fantastic. But in the context of Pink Floyd, I don't really like their stuff after Roger left.
They had their time in the sun.
Yeah. I mean, and there's some really good songs on, what was it? The Division Bell.
Mm-hmm.
And, whatever that other album after the Division Bell was.
Mm-hmm.
There's some good stuff on there. There's a couple of really good songs, but
A Momentary Lapse of Reason was
Momentary Lapse of Reason. Thank you. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And now that I'm looking back through their discography, Obscured by Clouds was that same lineup. Sid was not in the band during that era.
Sid Barrett.
Sid Barrett, yes, sorry. And let's see, Metal. He was not in the band during Metal either. So maybe I need to go back and listen to those 2 albums. Let's see, when was he? He wasn't in the band for Atom Heart Mother. I don't know, maybe just, wow, Sid was in the band for much less time than I thought. But they were, I don't know what it is. When they threw down with Dark Side, that clicked with me.
Yeah.
That's the era. When I went beyond that, I wasn't interested. And Beyond the Wall, I'm not terribly interested.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Well, Animals certainly was it's these are not songs you hear on the radio because they're too long.
Yeah.
So it's if you know Pink Floyd, you know them because of other albums.
Yeah.
However, I think Animals is one of the more compelling listens if you set aside some time, put on a good pair of headphones and listen to this album in its entirety, front to back. It is an experience.
Yeah.
And if you go into it knowing where Roger was coming from and what he was talking about, I think it adds to the experience. And ironically, things aren't much different these days. He could put that album out today and it would mean just as much.
Yeah, it would resonate just as deeply. Unfortunately, change some of the names, and you're right there.
So good pick, man. I don't think I could have come up with a better pick for the, if you're talking about Pink Floyd, I think that's an album that, I think that means, well, obviously means a great deal to you for a lot of reasons, but I also think it was a turning point in Pink Floyd's career.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
cool.
The beginning of the end, as it were.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So on that note, I think we'll leave everybody to go. Thanks for joining us for an episode of Music That Matters here on Different Strings, a guitar podcast. I don't know. It just cracks me up to say it that way. I don't know why. It's seriously childish at this point. As always, I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank Andrew for participating. For really, I mean, remember, this whole thing was his idea. So, not this segment, but doing the guitar podcast
in general, my idea, right?
Yeah, your idea, 100%. And I make him do all the work, which I'm absolutely grateful for. I just show up on our prescribed recording nights and
you provide the
basso
profundo. you provide the gravity, your voice provides the meaning behind this pot. You bring the depth, the weight of our words.
Well, as long as I don't treat you like Roger treats David.
No, please don't. Or like Wayne treats Garth. like a mole, like a growth.
And I think after your revelation, of the Josie and the Pussycats soundtrack album, we need to come up. I think homework for each of us is to come up with a soundtrack album for Music That Matters.
Oh, I like that. Okay.
And if we have to actually follow through with that, and we probably will.
I have one rule.
What's that?
Can't be Flash Gordon. Too easy.
Oh, you know what? I hadn't thought of that, and you're right. So let's say
too easy.
Let's say okay, yeah, not Flash Gordon. I was going to say like one of those soundtrack albums that's like assembled from a bunch of different songs or a bunch of different bands. Okay. That's what I was thinking of.
Okay.
So
I don't know. I feel like we should really branch out. Different Strings, a soundtrack podcast where we literally bring up any soundtrack that speaks to us at like a gut emotional level. I want to know what soundtrack from a movie just pulls you in and sucks you in with its emotion, its gravity. Because I got one off the tip of my tongue.
Is it Grease?
No. Is it Grease? No.
That's a great soundtrack, man.
No. Interstellar by Hans Zimmer. The soundtrack to Interstellar.
Oh, yeah. So you're thinking like orchestral soundtracks.
There's just actually the soundtrack to the second Christopher Nolan Batman movie by Hans Zimmer.
Oh, we're really going to have to flesh this idea out. Yeah.
Some of the most tense, just visceral orchestral soundtrack work I've heard in a long time, but Interstellar is right up there, just with emotional provocation. Thomas Henry, wait, Thomas Henry? What is his name? The guy that did the Wally soundtrack. That's Thomas Newman.
I don't know.
The guy that
Not Randy Newman.
Not Randy. His brother, Thomas Newman, did the soundtrack for Wally, and that is one of the greatest soundtracks.
Is that really Randy Newman's brother?
I believe he's his brother. Yeah. And capped off by a gut-wrenching song by Peter Gabriel. When the movie Wally ends and you get that Peter Gabriel song, it is gut-wrenching. It is emotionally gut-wrenching. Yeah.
Crying a little bit just now.
I'm feeling it, man. I'm telling you, we got to do a soundtrack episode now. You got me going.
Okay.
All right, but no Flash Gordon, Queen Flash Gordon. Too easy.
Well, yeah,
too easy. Too easy. All right. So, are we done?
Where were we? Yeah, I think we're done.
All right. So, www.differentstringspodcast.com for the Different Strings, a Guitar Adjacent podcast.
Yeah, and leave us your comments with what you think about the Animals album and what any Pink Floyd album, really, but especially Animals, because I'm always curious to hear if Animals has reached and touched people the same way it's reached and touched me.
And if you haven't listened to it, please do. It is a really compelling listen. Thank you for really giving me a reason to go back and listen to it. I forgot how amazing and how just emotional that album is. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
You are welcome.
Yeah.